What's good, guys? Welcome back to the channel. It pains me to make this video a little bit, but I do want to kind of address some things since whether we like it or not, Floodgates are still possibly in the meta, even though the last ban list hit goes in match, Rivalry of Warlords, and there can be only 1-1. There are still a lot of other Floodgates to choose from and to include in your side deck to combat the upcoming meta post Phantom Nightmare. So I want to talk through 6 Floodgates that I've found that I think are going to be applicable to the meta post Phantom Nightmare. And these are ones that are not commonly thought of. Like, yes, we still have Summon Limit, we still have Anti-Spell Fragrance, but I'm thinking outside the box just a little bit, and I want to kind of bring these to the light just so you don't get caught off guard by them, and you can consider them in your deck since they do have some applications more so for rogue decks than they do for the actual top tier meta decks. Okay, so the first card I want to talk about is going to be Anti-Human Intelligence Messiah. So this was a card, a pendulum card that came out, had a little bit of hype pre-release, and then it just tanked. Like, there is no use for this card ever since, but I do want to bring it to your attention because what this card does is when you place it in your pendulum zone as a spell card, it says any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead except monster cards. So to translate, all spells and trap cards are banished instead of going to the graveyard. Now, what comes to mind for this particular card? Well, runic decks, first of all. If you have this active, any runic card that your opponent activates is going to be banished, so they're going to have to get to their runic destruction to get rid of this thing before it banishes all of their runics, and they can't get any value out of Runic Fountain. And then also, now that we have Transaction Rollback in action, if this card is active, Transaction Rollback gets banished itself, if it's not already in the graveyard, plus all of the Welcome Labyrinth traps, Welcome and Big Welcome, are going to get banished as well after they resolve. So we won't have any trap cards in the graveyard for Transaction to copy the effect of, and it kind of just negates the whole new advantage of Transaction in Labyrinth. Not only that, if we switch over to Rescue Ace, all of the Rescue Ace spells and traps are going to get banished instead, which means they lose a lot of grind game off of like the emergency reset, the Rescue Ace headquarters, shuffle back in, and anything else that might recycle those spells and traps. And then if we look just at the Snake Eyes package, if we banish the Wanted and banish the original Sinful Spoils, they lose the ability to recycle those as well, get the extra draw, and get the extra put back or summon or whatever. So if we can actually set this card up, that means we can take away a lot of the grind game of the meta decks. And why might we play this card in particular? Well, it is searchable off of Small World. You could bridge into it somehow. It's a light Cyberse with a lot of attacks, so if you play Effect Veiler, I'm sure Effect Veiler is a fine bridge for most things. And then it's also searchable in niche situations by this card called Formud Skipper. So Formud Skipper, when it's sent to the graveyard as link material, can search the Anti-Human Intelligence Messiah. This is for very unique situations or unique decks that can take advantage of Formud Skipper, but I do want to just bring it to your attention that it is searchable in a couple of ways. Alright, so moving on to Messiah's counterpart. Instead of banishing all spells and traps, what if we just banish all monsters? So I want to reinvestigate Dimensional Fissure, which has seen some play. I've seen it in Runic Stun, I've seen it in Kashtira a little bit, but it does kind of wreck the Fire King deck and a bit of the Snake Eyes deck as well. Like, just removing those monster cards from the graveyard really hurts the grind game of those decks, and therefore just think about siding this in going first and just setting this up, especially if it doesn't hurt your deck that much. You know, if you don't care too much about banishing, like maybe you're playing Floowandereeze or Exosister or Kashtira or something like that, even Goaty, for example. Sprite might not be so bad, Labyrinth might not be so bad, so there are a lot of decks that can play Dimensional Fissure without being affected too much, where it will be actually much more of a problem for your opponent. And then while we're on the topic of banishing cards, The last one I will talk about in this category is going to be Macrocosmos, the original banishing all cards. Like, if Dimension Shifter is such a problem and everyone complains about Dimension Shifter, we have Trap Dimension Shifter Continuous. So, you know, don't forget about Macro as a possible floodgate to side in going second, especially if you can already set up your board. You know, even if your deck doesn't like Macro setup, if you've already set up your board and then flip Macro after, that's just like an auto game win a lot of the time. So I just want you guys to remember that these cards do exist and you can utilize them in your side deck for when you're going first to just win games. The next one I'm going to bring up is a little bit more known or more kind of like experimented with lately, and that is Gravekeepers Inscription. Now, this one is not a continuous spell, but you can activate this at the start of your main phase 1 and apply one of the following effects. Neither player can activate card effects in the graveyard for your turn and your opponent's following turn. Neither player can banish cards from the graveyard, and then neither player can special summon monsters from the graveyard. And this is huge against the Fire King deck. To activate that first effect, neither player can activate cards in the graveyard, and it even has a little bit of utility against the Labyrinth deck as well, because you can stop the furniture from going off and kind of recycling themselves. You can stop the big welcome graveyard effect. You can stop the welcome reset itself, transaction rollback in the graveyard effect, all of that. Like, there is a little bit of application against Labyrinth, but mainly this card is here to hit the Fire King deck and stop that Snake Eyes Flambridge Dragon as well. That card to summon back 2 from the 2 level 1s from the grave is going to be huge. So if your deck can utilize this, if you don't care about not activating graveyard effects, then consider this card before it gets popular and too expensive. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is going to be Deck Lockdown. So this one always kind of like surfaces at least a little bit when we're thinking about floodgates to side in for going first. And this one basically says your opponent cannot search cards, or neither player can search cards, and neither player can special summon monsters from the main deck. And if we know what the fire decks and the Labyrinth decks are trying to do, well, it's definitely search cards and special summon from the main deck. And therefore, once you set up your board, you can smack down this Deck Lockdown when you're going first, and your opponent is going to be in a rough spot. Even if it's destroyed by itself, by its own effect after 2 turns, you should still be able to end the game within 2 turns, because your opponent is going to be completely locked out of searching, completely locked out of summoning. Like big Welcome Labyrinth, and Welcome Labyrinth can't activate. You know, we can't activate the pot cards, Pot of Desires, Pot of Extrav, Pot of Duality, whatever. And you can't really, you know, kind of, you have to use what's in your hand. Like even Rescue Ace is going to have a hard time. They can't use Emergency, they can't use Hydrant to search, even though they can use Turbulence, but it's really difficult to get to Turbulence, or they have to draw it essentially without using any of their engines. So yeah, Deck Lockdown can be really strong against all of those top meta options, as it always is, and it's kind of just a forgotten about card that is super cheap and can be used in your side deck if you want. And then kind of along the same lines as Deck Lockdown, we also have one more card to talk about, and that is Mistake. So Mistake is just a face-up continuous trap floodgate that says cards cannot be added from either player's main deck to the hand except by drawing. So it just turns off all searches, which is really nice, especially when you're going first to set this up. Make your opponent like activate something to search, and then chain Mistake to it, and then they cannot resolve that search, nor can they activate any other search cards. So it's a really big, you know, hindrance to a lot of the decks. This card is not going to be very good against Labyrinth, not as good as Deck Lockdown will be, but it is nice that it's a trap that you can chain. And a lot of people are not siding very much back row removal these days, and especially if you're playing some kind of combo deck, or at least a little faster paced deck where you're not expected to side into floodgates or side into back row. You know, people are not going to side back row removal against you, so a lot of these times these cards will stick, and you can just win games off the back of these. So that pretty much wraps it up for me to, or in terms of floodgates to talk about for this upcoming format post Photon Hypernova, where we're dealing with the fire decks and the Labyrinth deck, and even the Vanadium deck is going to be affected by most of these as well. So yeah, whatever does come up to the top tiers, or whatever even in the kind of like tier 1.5 to tier 2 kind of decks, these are all going to be affected by macro and deck lockdown and that kind of thing. So consider adding these to your side deck. Don't forget, floodgates do exist, even though Ghost and Rivalry and TCB are gone, or at least down to 1. You can have other options. Whether you like it or not, these cards are available to play, and therefore you have to at least consider them in your side. So with that, that's going to be it. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying, and with that, we'll see you in the next one.